I'm Betsy DeWitt, current president of the board of the League of Women Voters of Brookline. And I'm welcoming all because we are presenting an interesting discussion about the ballot questions that will be coming up on the May 2nd election. And as you've seen, the program will be recorded, and then subsequently people can watch it on our local BIG television station online. So we welcome our speakers, Town Administrator Carey and Town Clerk Ben Kaufman, who will discuss both the format and the content of the ballot questions. First, we'll hear from the Town Clerk, who will explain what you'll see on the ballot. And we have understood from people and people who've actually submitted some questions that the format this time has been difficult to understand and maybe somewhat different from what people were accustomed to. Anyway, so we'll hear, Ben will tell you all you need to know, and we'll see if we have any more questions. And we also understand, I hope, Ben, you have your new printed booklet available to show everybody, because there's going to be information available to the public, which we have not done on necessarily other years. And then we will have our town administrator help us understand the content of the questions. And since I've looked at some of the preliminary questions that people have submitted, I gather there are lots of content questions, so be prepared. I'll give you the ones that people have submitted, but we will also, to the extent that we have time, and this is for the audience information, at the bottom of your screen, there is a little form that says raise hand. And after we have dealt with the previously submitted questions, we'll let our audience raise their hand with additional questions. So I just want you to know to look at the bottom of your screen. And the second thing is that it would really help us a lot if you would submit in the chat a brief form of the question you'd like to ask, if it hasn't already been answered, and that'll give us some indication of the overall direction that people are going in their questioning. So now I think we are ready to turn over the program first to Town Clerk Ben Kaufman, who will tell us how these questions are organized and help us understand how to understand them in order to vote as you would like to vote. Okay, Town Clerk, Mr. Kaufman, you have the floor.
So I want to just quickly run through a couple of things on the elections that we have coming up in May. I think it's always a good opportunity when there are a lot of people in a room to just do a little reminder of how to vote and information like that. And then we can definitely talk about the layout of the ballot, as well as the mailer that's going to be coming to everybody's household related to the ballot questions. And then I will hand it over to Town Administrator Carey, who is going to be better at answering questions about the ballot questions themselves, as opposed to the process of voting in these elections. So big election we have, May 2nd, is the annual town election. There's a lot of things on this ballot. We have townwide offices, select board, trustees of the public library, school committee, and housing authority. We also have town meeting in each precinct. And then the big ones that we're here to look at are the 4 ballot questions. Question 1 is a debt exclusion. Question 2A is an operating override. Question 2B is also an operating override, a little bit of a different look. And then question 3 is approval of a bylaw related to marijuana. The way these are laid out on the ballot is in the order that they're on this slide. You'll have the townwide offices listed first, then you will have the town meeting seats. And then you're going to have the ballot questions. And the questions are going to look a little bit different depending on which question you look at. Under state law, the only information that can be on the ballot for an operating override or a debt exclusion override is the text of the ballot question. So all you're going to see there is the actual text of the ballot question. For question 3, the law is different. You'll actually have a summary provided by town council included on the ballot. So it's a helpful reference if you're not quite sure what question 3 is doing. You'll have a summary included on that ballot. The sample ballots are actually available right now on the town clerk's website. If you go to brooklinema.gov/town clerk, you can see those sample ballots. Scroll down to your precinct. Some precincts might look a little bit different depending on what's going on with your town meeting. And if people would like, I'm happy to also share my screen and show what one of those ballots looks like online. The biggest question we've been getting from people is, what information will I get? Town meeting in January passed MGL Chapter 53, Section 18B, and this requires the town to send a mailing to voters with information about any local ballot question. This really came on the heels of question 5 in November. That was the question related to the fire stations. There wasn't information about that out, and voters had questions. I know my staff had questions, the town had questions, and we were not able to provide as much information as we would have liked. So by adopting this law, we are now going to be sending information very similar to the Red Book that the Secretary of State's office sends out in the lead into a state election. We're going to be sending it for this town election. What's going to be in the mailing is the text of the ballot question itself, a summary from town council, a one-sentence description of what a yes vote means, and a one-sentence description of what a no vote means, as well as arguments from the proponents and the opponents so that you can hear both sides and what they are talking about. This information is being mailed to every household with a registered voter in Brookline. Currently, our mailroom downstairs is sending them out. A couple flats of mailers went to the post office this morning. So you'll start getting those this weekend, right before mail ballots start to get sent out. So every household will get that. We're also posting a copy of it onto the town clerk's website, brooklinema.gov/town-clerk. It's in our elections information section. And we'll also have copies of this mailing available in polling locations on election day and during early voting. So if you leave yours at home and you want a copy, we will have extra copies available in the polling location for you. And if you guys would like after this, I'm happy to share my screen and show what that ballot question mailer actually looks like. Something I always think is important is reminding people, how do I vote? With the passage of the Votes Act in 2022, we have a lot more options to vote, and that extends to local questions. The select board voted to allow for both in-person early voting and also to maintain vote by mail options for local elections. So if you want to vote, you can vote by mail. Applications are available online, brooklinema.gov/vote by mail. Every single voter received a postcard that was mailed out by my office. It looks like the one that's on the screen here, the 2023 vote by mail application. You can fill out that postcard, just check which election you want and sign your name at the bottom, send it back to us, and we will send you a ballot. The deadline to apply for a vote by mail ballot is Tuesday, April 25th at 5 p.m. And every ballot we mail out, if you want it to count, we have to receive it back by 8 p.m. on election day. If you want to vote early in person, you can do that as well, starting on Saturday, the 22nd of April. And running until Friday, the 28th of April. That's going to happen at Town Hall every single day. Saturday and Sunday, it'll be from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. Otherwise, it's during our regular business hours. And this year, we are expanding our early voting options. So we will be at the Putterham Branch Library from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. on the 22nd. And we'll be at the Coolidge Corner Library from 1 p.m. until 4 p.m. on the 28th. So if that, on the 23rd, that's Sunday. So if that is easier for you, instead of having to come all the way down to Town Hall, if you want to go over to the Putterham Branch Library on Saturday the 22nd, to the Coolidge Corner Library on Sunday the 23rd, we will be there and you'll be able to vote. And of course, the third option is to vote in person on election day. Polls will be open from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. And I recommend you go to wheredoivotema.com. You can type in your address and it will tell you your polling location so you can get out and you can vote. I want to do a quick reminder for people who live in Precinct 16. You actually have two elections on May 2nd. You also have a special state primary. That is to fill a vacant seat for state representative in the 10th Suffolk District. Because it's a primary, you have 3 party ballots, Democrat, Republican, and Libertarian. If you're enrolled in one of those parties, you will receive that ballot if you ask for it. If you are not enrolled, then you need to tell us which ballot you want. So if you're unenrolled and independent, you need to tell us what. And for the special state primary, you can vote by mail. The postcard that you got has the option to say you want it for the town election and for the special state primary, as well as the special state election that will happen at the end of May. Or you can vote in person on election day in Precinct 16 at the Putterham Branch Library. That election is only for voters in precinct 16, so most people don't need to worry about it, but I always like to give a little reminder. And then my final reminder, you see this on the signs we put up all over town. It is your civic duty to vote. The League of Women Voters does a tremendous job informing people, making sure people know how to get out and vote. I really appreciate all of the work that you guys do. And I look forward to seeing everybody, whether it's I see you by postcard, in person during early voting, or on election day. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Ernie and Betsy, let me know if you would like for me to share my screen and show any of the ballots or any of the mailers, or if you want to kind of approach that as it comes.
I'd love to do that later, if you don't mind, Ben. Keep your screen handy. Let's look at the substance a little bit, and I just would like to say that there will be League of Women Voters registering high school students today in the afternoon, and others registering high school students. And there are League of Women Voters representatives registering people to vote at different locations around town. And we encourage anybody who knows of a newcomer or someone who has interest in local elections but hasn't registered to be sure to register. It's very important. And one of our basic tenets from the League is that your vote counts, so be sure you get counted. Moving on, we have now understood from Ben the organization and presentation of the ballot questions, but the big question that most people have been asking us is, what is this going to do, and how is it going to work, and what is the content? So we now will ask our town administrator, Carey, to give us the best answers to those questions that he can. So you are now designated to be the speaker, Mr. Carey, and share your screen if you would like to. But tell us what are these things trying to do?
Thank you, Mr.
Trying to do.
Yeah, and I want to, before I begin, just extend a special thanks to the clerk, Mr. Kaufman, and his staff. You know, I know everyone is always grateful for the efforts of staff in this community. But, you know, running this election, running a special election on the state side for one precinct only, and then going directly into town meeting from there, back at the high school for the first time in a long time. It's a lot of work that requires a lot of effort. And I know that Ben and his team are just working tirelessly. Well, I mean, I mentioned they must feel pretty tired, but they are working, you know, round the clock on these issues. And so if you see them around, you know, I often see Ben running in and out of town hall, trying to get everything, you know, the logistics together. Just tell him you appreciate that effort, because it means it really is an incredible effort. And I know the staff appreciate it when residents recognize that the just a huge amount of work that goes on there. So with that said, the ballot questions. Let me start with the traditional disclaimer here, which is I'm the town administrator. I am not an elected official. You know, the select board is the executive body of the town. I am the town's administrative officer. I handle day-to-day operations. I am not in charge of political decisions. And particularly, this is particularly important because under state law, I may not, as a employee of a municipality, use my time or the town's resources to influence the outcome of an election, which means I can't tell you to vote for.
Can I interrupt you just for a second?
Sure.
To say one of the reasons that this morning's information program is the way it is, and the reason that we invited the town administrator, is that as a nonpartisan organization, the League particularly wants to educate voters about the content and let the voter decide. And so we totally endorse your position. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know there's been a long history with my predecessor, Mr. Kleckner, of an excellent relationship with the League for that educational and operational purpose, to make sure people know how the town runs and what the substance of things is. And so I really appreciate being asked to be a part of this today. But I just want to set expectations accordingly. And, you know, sometimes I know that there are questions that people have where they say, well, this is a simple question of fact. But if it has a political implication to it, I need to be very careful about how I answer, lest it be construed as endorsing or not endorsing a particular political point of view. So I hope you will forgive me if in the course of your questions, I may not be able to give you as full an answer as you may be wanting for fear of treading over that line. What I will say is that as part of this new initiative that the town meeting passed in January, the ballot mailer that is going out has arguments for and against each question that have been drafted by advocates for those positions. And there are 150 words each. In many instances, advocates for those questions have included links and QR codes that you can follow if you were interested in additional material. So I hope that when, in terms of looking for more information, both for and against these questions, that mailer is of assistance to you. The ballot contains three questions, three main questions, one of which is broken up into two that we will discuss briefly. Right. Question one is the so-called debt exclusion. It is a question as to whether or not we as a community should be exempt from the what's called Proposition 2.5, which is a cap on property tax increases. Whether we can exempt the community from that cap for the amounts required to pay bonds to issue in order to pay for the costs of constructing a new pre-K-8 school, which includes renovations and additions to the existing historic Pierce School and other site improvements. So on that front, that question is about that temporary tax increase to pay for bonds. Now, you will notice one of the things about this question that has attracted the most attention among the community, and a lot of the questions that Mr. Frey has forwarded to me, is this question doesn't list how much it costs, right? It just says, can we be exempt to pay for the bonds? Whereas the next question has some dollar signs attached to it. Why are the dollar signs not on this question? The short answer is because as the state requires for questions like this, and this question has to be approved by bond counsel, it has to go through a number of hoops before it can even get on the ballot. The actual tenor of the question is solely about, can we issue the bonds, right? Can we exempt ourselves from the tax to issue bonds? The actual amount of bonds and the length of time that the bonds take to mature, all of that actually has to be set by the select board and town meeting. So this question is only about, can you actually issue the bonds, not how much is that going to cost, right? Whereas this next question, which concerns an operating override, is specifically about how much can you raise the property tax cap in town? To what dollar amount can you raise the property tax cap in town? This is just a general authorization to issue bonds up to the amount necessary to pay for this particular project. So this is why I think people see a lot of different numbers floating around, right? An initial project budget of up to $212 million that was signed for many different aspects of the project. Then you have the question of, well, the state is paying for some of it, so maybe we are only issuing bonds up to in the $170 million range. And that's a number that's been floating around as the cost of the project. So when you think about it from the perspective of the only purpose of this question is about the issuance of the bonds. It's not about the budget. It's not about the term of those bonds. It's not about any of those things. Then it becomes a little easier to understand why there's no dollar signs attached to the question. Although I don't think that makes it any less frustrating for people, because when you say we're going to raise taxes, I think the obvious question is, well, by what amount? So that is the situation here with question one, and why that question is structured the way it is. So question one, is a debt exclusion. And I think, when people talk about the term of the bonds, what I will say is the calculator on the website, which was crafted before this question was finalized, makes certain assumptions about the term of these bonds and when they're going to issue and what the interest rate is going to be. And when you make those kind of baseline assumptions, which includes a 25-year term and at the outer edge for the issuance of these bonds. So that's when we talk about temporary. That's one potential option that the town is being considering in terms of what the term would look like. The overall addition to the property tax rate is based on those assumptions on that calculator. And that comes out to around 4.5%. So that's question one. A yes vote on that question would allow the temporary property tax increase to pay for the bonds necessary for the Pierce School Building capital project. And a no vote would make no changes to the amount of property tax the town may raise, other than what is allowed by the traditional property tax cap allowed by the so-called Proposition 2.5. If we can move on to question 2. Question 2 is a question in 2 parts. As you can see on the ballot, if you look at this, they are separate questions. You may vote for or against each of these questions independently. And each question still requires a majority vote, just like everything else. But if both questions pass, the question with the highest dollar amount will prevail over the other. Question 2A has a lower dollar amount. Question 2B has a higher dollar amount. If question 2B passes, then the higher dollar amount controls, even if question 2A also passes. So question 2A asks whether the town should be allowed to assess an additional $11,983,367 in real estate tax, real estate and personal property taxes for the purpose of funding the cost of the Brookline Public Schools to the amount of $6,988,367 and municipal departments for $4,995,000 for the fiscal year beginning July 1, 2023. So this is what we refer to as an operating override. It is a permanent increase in property taxes. The way Brookline has historically structured its operating overrides and the way that this operating override is structured is that if it passes, this increase in property taxes will not be assessed all at once. It will be phased in over the course of 3 years. So in year 1, a lower amount will be assessed. In year 2, a slightly higher amount. And in year 3, the full 11 million, nearly $12 million in additional taxes will be assessed. And that will be the permanent increase going forward. So when you factor in those things from where it currently stands, that is a net increase in property taxes on the basis of this override of around 4.1%. Now, what are these line items meant to pay for? You know, it says the school and for the town. On the town website, if you go to the government tab, there is a separate page called FY24-26 override and debt exclusion. On that page are frequently asked questions and interactive operating override charts.
One of the sort of thematic questions we've gotten, which I think you're beginning to address here, is that the questions did not have dollar amounts specific. They say up to, or, you know, the amounts seem to be not final. And so perhaps you would address that question.
Sure. So these amounts are indeed final, right? This amount for the override is final. This is what the voters will be asked to approve, and this is what the town and schools have said that if it passes would be where the money would be spent. So on this, you can see here, this is from the brookline.ma.gov webpage. School budget restorations, you know, as the make up a significant portion of this base override. There's also new initiatives that the schools are intending to pursue. The town, we've broken this out into broader categories, which is closing a community upkeep gap, of which a large portion of this is for roads. It's $2.1 million at the end of the override for roads and complete streets. Restoring prior capacity that was cut during the pandemic, recruiting and retaining talent. A funding area that the town referred to as spending now to save later, which is increasing capacity in departments like planning in the aims of diversifying the community's tax base and community outreach and assistance. Those are the broad categories that the town set up. And you can see here that this is where I talked about how taxes increase over time, right? So in year 1 of the override, the town's share of the tax increase is $2.8 million, then 3.98. And then finally 4.995 at the outset there, at the end in year 3. The schools similarly, year 1, 4 million, year 2, 5.4 million, and then year 3, 6.98 million. That's how these efforts move forward. report. You can also see here that there is this operating override and debt exclusion calculator. One of the questions I've gotten from a number of people in town is, this calculator is helpful, but can it do more? Can it, for example, do this? Can it feed all the way back into or be prospective 10 years down the line? Can it include certain things or others? The answer here is, this page was developed before the ballot questions were set, but when it was close to being finalized. Now that this is set, now that the ballot questions are set, we cannot change this page any further. So because again, it goes to the question of if we make changes on one hand, or do we have to make changes on the other? Does that have that implication of electioneering? So this page is effectively kind of a museum page at this point, and additions cannot be made and changes cannot be made. But again, there are advocates for and against all of these questions, and I know that they are, aiming to convince people. So to the extent that you have questions about whether to vote for or against this, those advocates, I'm sure, on either side of this would be happy to hear from you. Question 3, as the town clerk said, because of the intricacies of Massachusetts law, there's a lot more information on the ballot about question 3, and the discussion of what it does and what it's meant to do. So it's question 3 is a bylaw amendment to limit the number of marijuana licenses in Brookline. In the fall of last year, town meeting voted to approve a cap on the number of recreational marijuana retailer licenses in the town. Historically, the number of recreational marijuana licenses in town has been pegged to a percentage of the number of package store licenses. Until recently, that number was 4 because it was a percentage of the number of package store licenses. But enough package store licenses have been issued that technically the number of available retail marijuana licenses in town is 5, of which 4 have been issued. So this is the voters, the town meeting voters approved putting this on the ballot, but in order for it to become law, it must be approved. It must be approved by the voters. So that is the gravamen of the question, whether for retail marijuana shops, rather than continuing to peg them to this floating number based on the percentage from a number of package stores, whether to have a hard cap at 4. So a yes vote on this institutes that hard cap, and a no vote on this keeps things as they are with the floating cap.
So does that end the description of the ballot questions and their content?
Yes.
Then would you please take a deep breath and be prepared to answer a few questions?
Sure. I already see some questions in the chat, and why don't I go from there?
Can I look at the chat and take them up as you do? Please do.
Yes.
Go ahead.
That. So the first question from Carolyn Paul says, even though the town is limited in what it can print on the ballot with respect to debt exclusion, why did the town choose not to provide on the new mailer the Pierce project budget signed off on leadership and submitted to the state, $212 million, the length of the tax increase, and other critical information for voters? This is what town meeting overwhelmingly voted for in January. So this was a subject of debate about finalizing the mailer at a recent select board meeting, and what town council explained at this point, and what I was mentioning about this issue of, what is the question really asking? The question is really asking simply about the issuance of the bonds, right? And so the question of the project's budget, what the ultimate project budget is going to be, is unsettled. And as you can see from the arguments of advocates for and against question 1, that is a subject of political debate. So for the town to kind of come in on that, which is an issue that is politically charged, and say, is this X number, is something that, I think the other side of, if we say one thing, the other side will say, well, that's insufficient, or that doesn't give enough explanation, or that's misleading. Similarly to the question of, the term of the temporary increase, right? That is a decision for town meeting to make. Town meeting may vote differently, right? Town meeting may vote not to approve the issuance of bonds at the recommended rate. That is a possibility. So we, in order to, I think sometimes I was sent, for example, a proposal, a ballot mailer from Sudbury, Massachusetts. And they said, well, Sudbury put the numbers for a debt exclusion on, why can't Brookline? And I think the answer there is because Sudbury did this another way around. They had town meeting vote first on the dollar amount and the structure of the bonds. So that was known at the time of the vote, whereas that is not known and not a guarantee here. So I understand people's frustration with what seems like a pretty simple question. What is it going to cost us? But the intricacies of that question are a subject of political debate and one that the town can't wade into. What I will say is on both the pro and against question one, there are arguments made about what that number is and why their sides choose that number to represent the cost of the project. And you can look at those and read those and find out which of those you want as persuasive.
Chaz, there's a footnote to that question that somebody sent me separately. Have we maxed out on the amount of money that would be available from the state for this project?
So the state has set the amount of money that is available for this project, and that my understanding is that will not change. I would refer specifics on the question of what money we got from the state and why to the Pierce Building Committee. I think they're better equipped to answer those questions than I am.
Okay. And the fact is that what we're talking about here in debt exclusion is the bonding is the term of the bond, which is not yet determined, or has that yet been, in other words, do we know how many years of borrowing would be required?
No.
Okay, then that answers that question. Thank you.
So there are a couple of questions, what happens to Pierce if the bonds don't issue? If the answer to this is yes, does the select board have the option to negotiate, explore a slightly different price tag? I think those are questions that I don't want to speculate on. Those are questions that have political implications. And so I apologize, but that's just not an area where I think it's appropriate for me to weigh in. Sarah O'Neill asks, if question one does not pass, what does that mean for question two? They are separate questions. They do not have an impact on one another, except, to the degree of, community impact. For example, in Newton recently, 2 debt exclusion questions for specific schools passed, but an operating override did not. As those were separate questions, what that means is that the debt exclusions will move forward, and the operating override increase in Newton will not. So that's an example, right? So question one and question two are independent of one another. You do not need to vote for one to vote for the other. A question from our end, isn't having the calendar set for only 1 year out a form of electioneering? Let me be clear, the calculator is not set for 1 year out. My understanding is the calculator is set for the entirety of the increase, right? So it is set for what the, at what year 3 of the override would look like. That's my understanding of how that calculator is set. And the reason why it's set this way is honestly, this is a community standard. Every time in recent history that the community has put an operating override on the ballot, this form of calculator has used. So altering that form of calculator, I think without a significant community discussion, would be a deviation from the community norm. So that's why the calculator is structured the way it is. Diane Sokol asks, and I think this is a good point. Can you guys go back to question 2B? Yes, that's a very important question, Diane. Thank you. Question 2B is an increase in the amount of from question 2A. Specifically, it asks for an additional $1.85 million to fund the cost of the municipal composting collection service. You can look back at the conversations that the select board had on this operating override. Those public conversations really date back, I would say, to September at their initial budget summit. But there's a recording of a subsequent budget summit in December that talks about the initial contours of a potential operating override. And from there, you can kind of draw a line through to a meeting on February 14th of the Select Board and Advisory Committee, at which both the schools and the town presented detailed presentations on what all the individual line items in the override looked like and how they were structured. This question 2B is effectively the inclusion of a so-called standalone line item, a standalone project that is not part of the initial package of requests developed for the operating override. And this project is a municipal composting project. This is the estimated cost of a municipal composting project that would be opt-in for members of the community who are receiving town trash pickup. And we estimated the cost of this at potentially $75, an additional $75 a year. We did this in the analysis is comparable to the private composting pickup currently available in town. So it would be an opt-in. It would be a pilot phased in over the course of 3 years. And so that cost of 1.85 reflects the offset from fees, whereas a fee-free program was estimated at around $2.25 million. And so the Select Board authorized this standalone question as an option for the community. If the community wishes to increase taxes for this express purpose of providing a municipal composting service, that's what question 2B is about. And again, the highest dollar amount controls. If question 2A passes, but gets more than 50% of the vote, but not question 2B, then question 2A controls. If question 2B gets the highest amount, even if question 2A does not, question 2B controls. And that means that all of those dollar amounts in question 2A are also passed in addition to the $1.85 million for composting. So there is no opportunity to vote on a standalone composting. The Select Board structured it in such a way, this is called a so-called pyramid override, where there's the base amount. And if you want to vote for more than the base amount, you can also vote for that. So that is the structure. Now, if neither 2A nor 2B passes, then these do not increase. There's no tax increase.
I have one on in the chat. You may have seen this, but it's sort of a good follow-up. Question is whether or not other budget items would be sacrificed because these items are getting, if they're passed, would be getting a guaranteed source of revenue. And the question is, what's the impact on the overall budget?
Oh, I'm sorry. Could you repeat that question? I'm so sorry.
Sure. It's one that says if 2A and 2B become permanent, concerned that things would have to be cut for other items that might be hurt because of, in effect, targeting the portion of the budget that is funded under these overrides.
Oh, I see. So because the question of what goes into the budget, right, is inherently a political one, I have to be cautious about that. Sure. The way that an override is structured is that for the term that the town phases in that the tax increases, if the town says on the ballot, on the ballot, we are using it for this purpose, then that money must be used for that purpose. So the reason why the structure of that, historically what Brookline has said is there are general line items on the ballot for town and schools, so that in the event that between those two entities, there may need to be some shifting in the event of emergency. That's possible. But the general commitment from the town in past overrides has been that what the town says it's going to spend the money on is what the town spends the money on for the term of the override and evaluates that at the end of the override. So I know that doesn't directly answer your question, because I think that question goes to more, if we have more money for these priorities, does that mean we might spend less money on other priorities? That's a political decision to make. And so I think that's outside the scope of my purview to say.
That's fine, Chaz. And now another one that seems also sort of a follow-up related has to do with the parking, which would be funded under, I guess, 2A, if it were to pass, or maybe 1 and 2A. I don't know. You tell me. But the issue here is to do with the cost of the underground parking, which is not exclusively for schools use.
So I want to be careful about getting into the scope of the Pierce project, what is and isn't included in that, how that's structured. I think that's a more kind of appropriate question for the Pierce School Committee when it comes to the specifics of how the parking lot renovations are going to work and how that factors into the cost of the project and how it's funded. What I will say on this is we had some questions on this ballot mailer. Can you be more specific about what some aspects of this are for versus others? And what town council said, and I think is correct, is we have to be careful about effectively picking favorites about things to talk more about, go into more detail about on the ballot mailer. If we say, well, we can explain more about the park, we can explain more about the parking, but less about some of the other things, then I think we would be accused of providing inadequate or weighted information. Whereas if you if you provide it for all of those, then you have a ballot mailer that's pages long. And that doesn't satisfy the requirement of the statute that it be brief. So this is the balance that we kind of have to strike in this environment.
So you want to continue looking at the chat? Can you read?
Sure. I see a question from Kathleen. The FY 2023 financial plan includes a structural gap between revenue and expenditures, ranging from 4.6 million to 21.3 million. That's over the course of time. Over the course, year over year, and it assumes in that instance a compounding deficit, which is to say that if we don't, if we continue, it just assumes that there's a continued increase in the amount of costs at the current rate and a continued amount of deficit. John, I want to answer John's question because that's a good point. I want to make sure that we don't put into get people in the wrong mindset there. But so in the FY 2023 fiscal plan, it assumes a projection out that the deficit compounds. Now, the efforts that Brookline makes on a year in year out basis is to mitigate that deficit, to try and mitigate that deficit through cuts. Through raising funds elsewhere, whether that is through overrides or through, for example, one of the components of the additional services that are being provided in part through overrides is an increase in solid waste fees, solid waste user fees. There is the discussion of the increase in parking fees from $1.25 an hour to $1.50 an hour. So the projections of the financial plan are from a static place, assuming growth. What it doesn't assume are the efforts that are taken to contain that deficit, which is why historically Brookline, projects that deficit out, but doesn't actually achieve it. We are at a deficit this year. The schools have posted their deficit and the town has posted theirs, and the town has posted what it will cut as part of that in a scenario where there is no override, right? So the town has to assume every year there's no override, there's none of that. So the town's budget reflects that scenario, which includes some cuts based on our fiscal projections, right? I want to emphasize that it's based on projections and it's not based on actual revenue. So it is important for people to know that our budget is based on those projections. John Maskoyak asks a question which I think is really important and I want to emphasize and correct. I mentioned this idea of the calculator coming from the end of the override. What I meant by that was the end of the term in which the tax increases are phased in, which is to say year one, some tax, year two, more tax, year three, the full $12 million tax amount. That is a permanent tax increase. I want to make sure that no one is, I want to make sure that no one is misled or feels like that's not the case, right? An operating override is a permanent increase in taxes. So at the end of the override means at the end of the period of time in which the town would phase that increase in. Kathleen asks, real estate taxes account for 73% of revenue. How is it possible to cover the gap for increased revenues from the balance of 27%? That is the, Brookline, the budget this year is $404 million. That is the $404 million question, Kathleen. How does Brookline balance its revenues and expenditures? How do we, as a community, figure out how we provide the level of services we want to provide within the means that we have available to us, whether that is tax, real estate taxes, or whatever. And that is the balance of municipal government. That is the core of the question.
I have a sort of a footnote follow-up maybe for you for that, Chaz, and that is the town is obliged to publish its financial plan,
yes,
which is a monster document, which might not, because of the timing, it cannot take into account the result of these ballot questions. It can propose the impact if, but it cannot say it has passed, therefore. What it can say is, here's our financial plan based on, and you can fill in the blanks there, but it is certainly an extraordinarily detailed description of the town's services and where revenues go to support those services in many, many ways and many levels.
Right. Thank you for that, Mr. Witt, because that's correct. And I think the other thing that folks, see in this as part of the broader sort of budget discussion, right, is we set the budget in the spring. We set the budget in spring, early summer. We say this is our fiscal year budget. We look at it again in November for any potential adjustments at the special town meeting, where as opposed to operating primarily on projections, we're focusing on actuals. In some years, the actuals have been worse. In some years, the actuals have been better. One thing that Brookline cannot do, and that no Massachusetts municipality can do, with some exceptions for things like snow removal, is run a deficit. We are not allowed to deficit spend. So oftentimes when people talk about the fiscal plan and projections, people say, well, why is it structured this way? Why are your projections in this matter? And the answer is, especially for communities that have a AAA bond rating like we do, we have to be very cautious in our fiscal projections to ensure that we do not run towards that deficit spending. We cannot make rosy assumptions about what a banner year might look like for the town and then budget off of that. We have to base our projections on, the facts on the ground. This year, we were very fortunate. We had a combination of events that resulted in a so-called free cash number that's higher than the town has had in recent memory. And a lot of that money is being put back into the kinds of services that the community has really been asking for a long time that we haven't had the money to accomplish. But that's a one-time thing. We can't expect that kind of banner year, year in, year out. We have traditional projections for free cash, and we use those appropriately. So this is the ins and outs of municipal government. And I'm glad there are so many people here thinking about these questions, because I think this is a broader kind of community dialogue. What are the community's priorities and how should we pay for them? John asks, and John, I wonder if you could clarify this question. Do the earmarks become permanent if they are tied to the vote? Does that mean that for those, for that pie chart that I showed? Oh, I see. For example, what if funds for composting aren't fully spent? If funds for composting aren't fully spent, there could be a number of potential options. I don't want to speculate about what the town would do in those circumstances in the future. What I would say is the commitment, right, on the ballot question, like I said, right, that question 2B commits at up to $1.85 million for composting. So it's not like if it comes in under budget, the town necessarily can say, okay, well, we've got 1.5, now we'll spend 0.35 on something else. We have to look at that from that perspective. So whether that is restructuring elements of that, setting up some sort of funding, or not increasing the levy, those are all discussions that the select board and town meeting can have about that eventuality.
So, Chaz, I think we've gone through what's in the. Oh wait, maybe there's another one there. But
just one. I see two.
Okay, more coming every time.
Yes. Right. Again, pyramid format has the effect of limiting choice. Is this format universal? If not, when did Brookline choose to adopt it? How is this decision made? This is not universal. Brookline has had pyramid overrides in the past, I believe in 2008, possibly, and maybe 2015. I will double check. But yes, Brookline has in the past adopted this so-called pyramid form. And how is that decision made? The select board decides. how the ballot questions are structured. The select board had a discussion about this in May, and that there was in March, and that was part of the discussion, whether it would be a standalone question or a pyramid question. The select board ultimately decided for a pyramid question. Jocelyn Murphy, 2 questions on question 1. What will happen if the building project exceeds the budgeted amount? And why does the question refer to renovation of the park? Again, I think those are questions better answered by the building committee on this. I don't want to speculate on what the community would do in the event that it ran over budget or what those renovations would be. John asks, would an underride be possible for unspent funds? Yes, it is always possible for the community to vote to lower its maximum tax levy. An underride is possible in all circumstances. It's not common. Communities rarely vote to lower their tax base once they've established it. Yes, it is possible to have an underride on the ballot that voluntarily lowers the community tax levy. John Harris asks, question 1, the cost estimates for the full rebuild proposal, $212 million minus the amount paid by the state, but has Spend Smart Brookline, which is an advocacy group, issued a cost estimate of its proposed more modest renovation. I think that's a question better suited to the advocacy group in question, John. I don't know the answer to that. I wouldn't want to comment on that.
I think we've gone through the whole of the chat questions, which were both lengthy, extensive, and broad, and very much appreciate your willingness to attempt to help us understand and do your best to answer. And I say that because I don't think we ever expected you would have in your mind all of the level of detail that might be people might be asking you for. But I do appreciate it. I think this has been very helpful and for me, informative, and I hope for our audience, very informative. And I just want to say in closing that we appreciate having as many people join us, as many people fill out the questions in the chat. And I'm just going to point out that this is a League of Women Voters voter education project. And for the permanent long-term thing, I want you to know that the League has adopted something called Vote 411. You can go online and see all of the information you might want to know about candidates for both your precinct and townwide offices. We are very hopeful that this online version of our old-fashioned voter's guide will be helpful and useful for everybody. It's also part of our voter education mission. And just for the record, the voter's guide will be printed in limited numbers, and we'll try to put them in public locations like the libraries and town hall and some other places around town. But for voter information, particularly about the town election and the candidates, it's best to go to the Brookline League of Women Voters website and click on Vote 411, which gives you an opportunity to fill in your information and to understand who is running in your precinct, as well as the townwide offices. So on that little promotion note, I will then say, thank you very much to Ben and Chaz for being with us and contributing to this. It was a very helpful, useful discussion. And I think it was illustrative from a fairly informed group of citizens about the confusion and complexity of these particular ballot questions. And I understand that the intention has been to let the voters decide. That's the point. But it's tough when voters don't always understand exactly what they're doing and how to decide it. But I really appreciate Ben and Chaz both being helpful. I'm looking forward to getting the voting pamphlet coming from the town clerk. And I hope that everybody feels better informed as a result of this. Chaz, you had your mouth open.
Yes, because I was going to say, I'm going to post in the chat one more time the direct link to the Override Central page, because folks were asking for that. That's also available as a source of information. It does have, an individual asked at the bottom, more about the line items of the
good.
override. That contains links to presentations that the superintendent and I both made on February 14th to the select board and the advisory committee about the line items in that and questions 2A and 2B. So if you'd like more information about that, that's where it is.
Well, this has been very, very helpful, and I appreciate having you both with us. And I believe this was a useful and informative experience for folks who are learning, helping themselves understand how the what is the impact of my vote, and also some of the more complexities of how the town budget is organized. And we really, really appreciate that. And we very much appreciate the fact that it has been done in a nonpartisan fashion. So thanks from the league and all of the audience to both Chaz and Ben. And we will, I hope, have another opportunity somewhere down the road to give you another voter education opportunity.